Hey everyone, before we start today's episode, I wanted to quickly tell you about the membership drive that I am doing on patreon.com/FireTheseTimes to celebrate over 2 years of this podcast. If we hit the goal of 100 new supporters at $5 or more a month or $50 a year, I'll be able to hire a producer, which would give me more time to focus on the research and interviews and actually start releasing 2 episodes a week instead of 1. If you become a supporter, in addition to getting early access to all episodes, you will also have access to our monthly hangout, in which myself and everyone else who supports this project come together and chat about pretty much everything. It happens every month on a Saturday, and you have access to the link and everything related to that on Patreon. And lastly, if you cannot donate, you can still support by sharing this podcast with your friends and families and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts. This helps get more exposure to this podcast and introduce it to more folks. You can also follow this podcast and project on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Substack, and of course the main website. So thanks again everyone, and I hope you enjoy this conversation.
My name is Teklehaymanot Weldemichel. I'm a Tigrayan and I'm based in Norway. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Previously, I used to work on conservation policies in Kenya and Tanzania. To some extent, I write about state violence in relation to conservation. And currently I work on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and how they are translated into planning and practice in Norway. But at the same time, since the outbreak of the war, I kind of shifted to the war, as it is personal to me, and it is an urgent matter to talk about. That's what I can say about myself.
Amazing. Thank you a lot for taking the time to come on today. As you said, we'll be talking about the war in Tigray. And given that I think it's safe to assume that most people, if they do know, they know maybe some of the headlines, and we will get into the problem with the lack of media coverage as well, obviously, in this conversation. But let's just start with kind of a broad question, because I think we need to assume listeners don't know enough, as I said, to follow a conversation. So let me ask you this, in a very, very broad way, and please take your time in answering this, because obviously it's already a big question. So what is happening in Tigray, and why did it escalate so quickly?
Yeah, so maybe I should just a little bit talk about where Tigray is and what kind of country Ethiopia is. So Tigray is the northernmost region in Ethiopia, and it borders Eritrea to the north and the other part of the country to the south, and a little bit of Sudan to the western side of Tigray. And for the last 19 months, there has been a brutal war that started on the night of the 3rd of November 2020. And so we have had, this is a war declared by the Ethiopian state in collaboration with the Eritrean regime and ethnic militias and security forces from the different regions in Ethiopia. So Ethiopian and Eritrean armies started invading Tigray on the night of the 3rd of November. And within 3 weeks after the start of the war, that's on the 28th of November, the Ethiopian Prime Minister declared that his army and allied forces that are allied to it managed to capture Mekelle, and he declared that he has won the war. But however, we saw in the coming many months, we saw that the Ethiopian army, Eritrean army, and allied armed groups from all the regions in the country, going from a region, from village to village, from town to town, massacring villagers and people of all walks of life. And we've seen rapes, systematic rapes of women and girls across Tigray, and it went on for 8 months across the region, and we saw the Tigrayan forces sort of retreating to the mountains and taking cover in mountains and sort of regrouping throughout the 8 months between November and June. And as I said, even though he declared victory, the war didn't stop. And the declaration of victory was that the war has ended. He clearly said that the war has ended. And the declaration of victory was to sort of like show the world that we have done the operation and we are done with it. But it went on, and one of the aspects of the war was the brutality against civilians across the region, and the scale of displacement, the scale of civilian displacement across the region. At the height of the campaign, we have had like 3.5 million of the more than 6 million Tigrayans in being displaced from their homes. And we also see like the entire western Tigray, west of the Teklehaymanot River, sort of like ethnically cleansed, and which means, according to the UN, the more than 1.2 million residents of the western Tigray were either forced off their home, like into sort of like concentration camps in the center of Tigray, or they were massacred or sent to concentration camps. So you have that on the west side, on the western side, and we also keep getting reports of like more further killings and people being thrown to concentration camps where they are allegedly tortured, starved to death, or killed, extrajudicially killed, and thrown to rivers and all that. And we have seen bodies floating down in Sudan, washed out of the western side of Tigray. And like I said, between November 2020 and June 2021, almost the entire region was under occupation, under the occupation of the invading armies. But in a major turn of events, military turn of events, the Tigrayan force, which had retreated to the mountains, managed to regroup and to fight the Ethiopian army. And we, in middle of June last year, we saw Tigrayan forces routing the Ethiopian army in south of central Tigray, and that led to the withdrawal of the Ethiopian army from Mekelle, from the capital, and from a large part of Tigray. And this was also followed by the withdrawal of the Eritrean forces from the Tigray central, the main part of Tigray, and retreating towards the borders and still controlling some parts. And what is left under the occupation is the western side of Tigray. And on the 28th of June, that's the day when the Ethiopian forces withdrew from Mekelle, the Ethiopian Prime Minister declared that he is going for a unilateral ceasefire, which means there will not be fighting within the borders of Tigray. Despite that declaration, we could see that this wasn't a ceasefire, because the next day he was addressing the public and the media, saying that this was to give the Tigrayans some time to think about how they want to relate with the Ethiopian state, and to give Tigrayans some time means to also blockade the region and in order to show the power of the Ethiopian state, and that they did. So since the end of June last year, the entire region has been under siege, a full scale siege, which means we haven't had any basic social services such as like medical supplies, medical services. We haven't had banking, telecom, power, and all kind of services. And we haven't, between July, which is the beginning of July last year, and now, only 4 to 5% of much needed humanitarian supplies made it into Tigray. So the crisis is like a staggering crisis, and this is the siege follows a prior systematic destruction of the basic economic infrastructures in the region, which is the schools, the health facilities, the economic infrastructures like industries, and all of them were systematically destroyed and looted and transported across the borders into Eritrea and to the rest of Ethiopia. which makes the siege made more deadly because the infrastructures have been destroyed, and then you have a siege, which means you cannot even rebuild life. You cannot even do anything to bring the livelihoods back. So you have a deadly combination of siege and systematic destruction. That's the situation in Tigray. But we also the second question you asked was about like why did we end up here? Like how did the situation escalate quickly? So this was this wasn't supposed to be a war. This wasn't supposed to be a physical like armed war. It was a political difference between the central government ruled by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and the governing party of the regional state of Tigray. Uh, Something that I forgot to mention earlier is that Ethiopia is a federation. The reason we have a federation is because we had it's an empire. Ethiopia is it's an empire with a long history, and it's an empire means it had a long succession of imperialists that ruled the country with a central grip on all its people. But that empire, like the imperial rule, ended in 1974 with the disposal of Haile Selassie, the last king in Ethiopia. Following the overthrowing of Haile Selassie, we had a military junta that ruled Ethiopia between 1974 and 1991, and that junta brutalized the country. And the brutality of that regime led to many rebel groups fighting the Ethiopian state, fighting for autonomy of regions. And one of the regions that fought hard against the junta was the Tigray region under the leadership of the TPLF, the Tigray People Liberation Front. And that war ended with the overthrowing of the junta in 1991. And between 1991 and 1995, we had a transition period. In 1995, Ethiopia became a federation. A federation means you have a constitution that allows regional autonomy, that recognizes cultural, linguistic, heritage of the people that occupy those territories. And so that led to the formation of sort of like semi-autonomous regional states. And so we had, to some degree, a functioning state, a functioning government between 1995 and 2018, despite all the problems, despite the authoritarian tendencies that it had. The economy was functioning, the economy was growing well. The country was kind of considered as a regional anchor of stability in terms of like the fact that we have shared boundaries with Somalia, Sudan, and other countries means we were relatively the most stable country. But of course, as the government wasn't addressing all the questions that people had in terms of like recognizing even more autonomy, giving more rights to ethnic minorities, ethnic groups, there were ongoing protests, particularly by the Oromos that started in 2014 and continued until 2018, and which were later joined by other groups, such as Amharas. Amharas are the historical ruling ethnic group in the country. So they had grievances with the fact that Ethiopia was reformulated, reorganized in a different way. So they had questions regarding that, and they joined the Oromos, which was also an odd combination because Oromos had historically fought for more autonomy, not for a centralized country. So combining this Oromo Amhara resistance against the state was really weird from the beginning. So in 2000, that led to the resignation of the prime minister in 2018, and we got a new prime minister that was nominated by his party in April 2018. That was Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, the guy we have now. So while the initial assumption when he came to power was that he would continue the federal state, he would continue the state that recognized the cultural differences, the cultural and linguistic differences. He kind of relapsed to the old Ethiopia, and that has a lot to do with the way he came to power. The fact that we had an Oromo and Amhara combination, where the Amharas are historically dominant in the political body politic of the country, and who have interest in recentralizing the country. And Abiy kind of shifted his power base to the Amhara through that period. And from 2018, we saw sort of like pretty fast change towards the relapse towards pre-1991 kind of Ethiopian state. And Tigray wasn't happy about that, and because we fought for more autonomy. And then at the continuation of that, you could see the tensions building between the central government and the Tigray leadership and the Tigray public in general. And we also saw Abiy sort of trying to consolidate power, trying to stay in power. And one way of doing that was to for example, extend or postpone the election in 2000, which was supposed to be in May 2020. While for an Ethiopian and for someone who was following the process, I could see that there was no preparation going on for the election, which normally takes months. But then the COVID pandemic came, and then Abiy took that as an opportunity and said, like, we have a pandemic now, so we can't go for election. But then that's against the constitution. That's against the things that we agreed on, that we have to have every 5 years. We have to have elections, and we have had elections every 5 years, despite the problems with the election. And Tigray opposed that, and then we went on to hold an regional election, which is constitutional, by the way, in September 2020. And that was a sort of final trigger point towards the war. So Tigray held its own regional council election, which is to establish a regional government, and that kind of like made the Ethiopian state and the people who supported the Ethiopian state angry. And that following that, we could see Abiy kind of putting a lot of measures to ensure that Tigray doesn't establish a government. And then we have the war coming up just 1.5 months later. So that's how we ended up in the war.
Thank you so much. This was really all-encompassing, and I got obviously many thoughts, but one of them is that there's clearly an element of premeditation. There's clearly an element of policy making. This isn't just something that happened due to like ancient differences or whatever, as I sometimes see in media coverage. And as someone from the Arab world, I definitely sympathize of seeing these ancient differences, discourses always trumping local dynamics and more recent dynamics, because what you're talking about is really something that in many ways, of course, there's always background and historical roots and context for everything, but in many ways it's like a conscious decision by a relatively small number of people, including the current prime minister, who we'll get into that a bit more later. But we are talking about someone who like won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019 and did supposedly peace with Eritrea in 2019, which was portrayed as a big deal, and I'm sure to some extent it was. And then not that long after, less a year or so after, we already start seeing the beginning of what we're talking about now. Let's get into it a bit more, if that's okay. You wrote a paper in November 2021, I believe, and it's entitled "Inventing Hell: How the Ethiopian and Eritrean Regimes Produce Famine in Tigray." I'll just read the abstract, if that's okay, and then I'll ask you to kind of walk us through it. Okay, so this is the abstract. It has been a year since a devastating war broke out in the Tigray region. And again, this was published in November 2021. Northern Ethiopia, where hundreds of thousands of Tigrayan civilians are killed, millions internally displaced, and tens of thousands have fled to seek refuge in neighboring Sudan. An alarming development linked to this war is the man-made famine in Tigray that now threatens the lives of the millions of civilians who survived the horrific atrocities during the war. This piece is an attempt to explain why millions of Tigrayans from all walks of life face famine, and concludes that famine was from the start an end goal of the Ethiopian and Eritrean regimes, and they employed different tactics to ensure that it unfolds the way it does now. Among others, the tactics include 1. The systematic looting and destruction of Tigray's basic economic infrastructures, and 2. Implementation of different financial measures to deprive people in the region of access to cash, and the imposition of a complete siege that hindered access to supplies, including life-saving humanitarian assistance, end quote. So, I remember around last year, I think, when I started paying attention, especially to the internet blackouts, because I've been following one of these accounts that I forgot what's the name of that specific account, but that follows those kinds of like internet blackouts from Myanmar at the time, and including in Tigray, as we've been talking about. And I've also read reports from a few months ago, I think, if I remember my timeline correctly, of how like the vast majority of humanitarian assistance, as you mentioned, have not been passing through, with including questions as to the role of the UN in all of this. So in this paper, which again came out several months ago in November 2021, so you argue that famine specifically was an end goal of the Ethiopian and Eritrean regimes, and that there were these two main tactics that I mentioned. Can you walk us through it a bit?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that paper up. I mean, like, maybe it has become a little bit obscure, but it should have been read widely. The reason I wrote that paper is because we had, even though there is like almost a complete internet blackout in the region, there has been trickling out small evidences of what's going on. And the media has been, to some extent, reporting on what's going on in terms of like this many people have died, this many people have been abused, and all that. So, and we also see like reports coming out of like famine, like hunger, ongoing hunger in the region. But they are like pieces of stories, not a continuous story. The article was an attempt to show the broader the broader structure of the famine. And to do that, someone has to follow from what was going on just before the start of the war, at least to cut the timeline just before the start of the war and during the war. And I've been doing that, as I said, it is directly affecting myself. So for normally we just the assumption is that whenever there is war, there is some kind of hunger, famine that is associated to it, and usually as sort of like collateral damage or a sort of byproduct of a war. But the article is to show that it is not a byproduct of war. It is part of the design of this war, and part of the design of sort of a genocidal war, which I will come back to explain a little bit later. So, as you noticed from reading the article, the regimes deployed several tactics to produce the famine conditions in the region. One of the first things that you notice from the war is the scale of destruction that was caused by the war. And this is not destruction caused by crossfires between warring factions. It isn't destruction caused by by accident during the war. It is systematic. If you go from like even on the map, like you could even see it from satellite image on the map. If you go from factory to factory across the towns in Tigray, you see all the factories are down, either bombed shelled by aircrafts or torched to the ground by invading armies. You also see entire villages razed to the ground. You see farms burned down, or their assets looted by the troops. We have had short like stories coming out of troops going to orchards, to gardens, cutting down trees to make sure that people don't have access to fruits from their gardens. And this isn't like isolated to few villages or few towns. It is across the region, across the board. And when you see that, you see the intention of the the regimes to some extent. You see what they are trying to do. We also saw like troops stealing, looting crops from the farmers' silos and burning or watering them down before they leave if they can't take it. They're putting water into the silos. We have seen all kind of brutalities against the livelihood basis of the people. And that's one way of producing famine. And the other mechanism that they put in place, which started prior to the war, is the financial measures that they put in place. So I think only 1.5 months before the war, the Ethiopian Central Bank, the National Bank, declared that they have changed the currency notes. So they printed new notes, and they asked people to exchange their old notes, because this is a very cash-based economy. So they asked people to exchange their notes. You would have to go to a commercial bank branch to exchange your currency note. And Tigray isn't in the center, so it is a periphery. So cash had to be flown into Tigray. So only few of the bank branches in Tigray had received cash to exchange the old notes from which were in the hands of people. And then the war started, and a lot of many Tigrayans haven't had the opportunity to change their currency notes. So they had, when the war broke out and when the banking system was suspended, people had expired banknotes on their hands across the region. So you have that way they eliminated all the cash that people had in their hands. But even for the people who were able to exchange their cash, who lived in towns or in bigger places, so if you had a million birr in your hand or a million Ethiopian notes in your hand, you cannot exchange and take a new note, a million notes back to yourself. You have to deposit. I think it was 50,000 limit. Like you can only take 50,000. Prior to that, there was never a limit as to how much people can carry on their hands. But when they exchanged, they said like, oh, so only 50,000 is allowed to take out. So even if you have managed to exchange your currency notes, you would have to deposit the rest of the money and take only 50,000. So that way, the state managed to collect all the money, the cash that was in the economy, and the war started. And the moment the war started, all the banking services and the telecom and power and all kind of services were suspended, and accounts owned by Tigrayans or accounts that were opened in branch or commercial bank branch in Tigray were all suspended. So even if you lived outside the region, and if you had a bank account that was open in Tigray, you cannot access your bank account, but you cannot access your own savings. You cannot receive payments or send payments. So they basically crippled the economic capabilities of people to survive. And this went on, and for a brief moment between January and June of 2021, there were like few branches in Tigray that were open, so people were traveling from like extremely far places to withdraw money, and like with a lot of risk of being kidnapped and killed by Ethiopian and Eritrean troops. So this was one of the ways that they instituted like famine, like the conditions for creating famine. And I'll come back to that, but that's also one of the things. And then in June 2021, like I said earlier, the Ethiopian Prime Minister declared that they have declared ceasefire, unilateral ceasefire, which was basically a siege, because when the Ethiopian troops left Mekelle or Tigray, they have withdrawn. I mean, a lot of them withdrawn the cash that was in the bank. They took the cash that was deposited in banks and took them back to Ethiopia, and which means the banks were like they had no cash to give to people, and all services, banking services, telecom services were fully suspended. In large parts of Tigray, this was going on since the beginning of the war, but in major cities, this happened the complete blockade happened after the withdrawal of the Ethiopian troops, which means in large parts of Tigray, people haven't been paid. If you worked in a factory, if you worked in a business, if you owned a business, you haven't been paid. You haven't had access to your own savings. So people, including my own colleagues at the university, are starving to death. We are hearing new reports of academics dying from starvation because they don't have anything to eat. We are hearing business people suffering from access to medical supplies because they can't buy medicine. We are hearing I have millionaire friends who had businesses, who owned businesses before, who are now begging for money because they can't access their own bank accounts. So this was clearly by design. So first the destruction, I mean the financial measures, the destruction, and now we have a full stage that made it possible for the Ethiopian state and the Eritrean state to institute famine, to create famine conditions in the region.
Thank you again a lot for that answer. It is very clearly, because there is obviously a difference between man-made famine and a quote-unquote natural disaster-linked famine. Although even in those cases, often there is obviously a man-made component, because what usually happens, my understanding, is that food can still be accessible unless obviously there's a siege situation, but people cannot afford to buy the food that they need.
Yeah.
Or the goods that they need, and so on, and this seems to be the case now.
But I think something that I also forgot to mention, that is like you have one of the first things that they did is, like, for example, cleansing Western Tigray, which is 1.2 million Tigrayans from the western side of Tigray are now living in unfinished buildings and schools and concentration camps in the rest of Tigray. And these people neither have access to their homes or to bank accounts or to anything or humanitarian aid. So that's clearly, when you have this many people displaced living without any assistance, you can imagine the stress that it creates in terms of food and food security. So the displacement, the pushing away of people from their homes is also part of the process of making famine possible.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a policy of collective punishment. It's pretty obvious case. Straightforward example of that. And obviously, we've seen a lot of kind of Tigrayans in the diaspora, calling for an end to the atrocities and calling for action to be taken. And obviously, you're part of them, and you're personally going through this as well. There's multiple elements to this question, so I'll just start with the first question, if that makes sense. Can you talk a bit about the personal cost? I listened to an interview that you did, I think a few weeks ago or something, and you're talking about your own family. They had a farm, and I think Eritrean troops occupied it at some point. Can you sort of talk about the personal element behind all of this?
It would not be an exaggeration if I say I haven't had a proper sleep for almost 19 months now, and that's because of the war, and it has affected me personally directly with my family being in Tigray and with that. And so I grew up in a rural village in central Tigray with my siblings, and all of my siblings, we have gone to school, finished, and we've had jobs in cities. In different parts of Tigray. My parents, just my parents, they lived in the farm where we grew up. They had a nice, beautiful garden with all kind of fruit trees, and they lived off the farm until November 2020. And one of the things that happened is I have, for example, one of my sisters. She was living in Western Tigray, in a small town in Western Tigray, and when the war started, it started through Western Tigray. So she had to escape to central Tigray, where my parents live, to escape from the war. But it was only a couple of days, few days later, that the Eritrean troops managed to go into central Tigray, to the village where my parents lived. So my sister had to my sister, along with my mother and my sister's three kids, had to escape from village to village. It was almost like 100 days between beginning of November and end of January, from village to village, escaping shellings and like executions and all that. And it took them almost 3 months to finally end up in a place where they could actually stay longer than that. So I have in the beginning I haven't heard from my family. I didn't know what was happening. Like it's this blank feeling, like you don't know, you have no idea what's going to happen. Like you have no idea if you will ever hear from your family. So that went on, and at the end of January I got a call from my mother, who told me about what was going on. So she said, like, your father, he's in his late 80s, so he couldn't escape, so he had to move to a neighboring, like, a village which was a little bit out of the main road. So he was hiding in some friend's home. But my mother and her daughter and her grandkids had to run from village to village for months, and then they ended up in a town. But then somehow she managed to sneak into the village and to see what happened to the house. And so what she found was heartbreaking, because everything that we owned, like pictures and anything, memory in the house, is gone. Uh, and the main house was shelled because a bomb landed next to it, and the roof of the house was was damaged. So they had to, and then for months between November and June, the Eritrean troops had made the area like their main base. So people could not stay in their homes; they had to live somewhere else. So my parents managed to go into town where my brother was living. So they the last time I heard from them was in June last year. So they were staying with my brother, and that was before the Eritrean troops withdrew from central Tigray. And and this is not just about my family. It is, I'm actually one of the few lucky people that was able to communicate with the family, with family and friends after the war. There are friends that I know in the diaspora who have no idea about where their families are, if they are alive, or if they have been killed, or they haven't heard from the beginning of the war. And it's not about family; it's friends, it's the people that you know, it's the neighbors, it's all the people that you care about. And and at least just from the village where I grew up, which is not a big village, we, I have heard that about 25 people were killed. Some of them are my classmates, my childhood classmates. Some of them are relatives, like cousins and uncles and all that. And the way the killings were carried out are brutal. And to hear that from your own mother, mothers are usually, they don't tell this kind of gross stuff, but to hear that from your mother shows the extent of the damage that they have done to people. And I was also, at some point, I even tweeted about it. I was After I talked to my sister, I can't believe that my nieces, like nieces as young as 4, we're seeing dead people everywhere. And it's the thought of that is just really harrowing to think. And those kind of imaginations keep you awake and keep you, yeah. So that has been my yeah.
Thank you for explaining that as well. I'm just struck. I remember from that other interview as well. I'm just struck by the detail of they even took family photos. I, I mean, they're just very specific. It seems like it is really done for the particular purpose of humiliation. Like it's an end goal in and of itself. And I mean, okay, so the second part of that is I was going to ask you about the term genocide, because obviously you've mentioned it, and a lot of Tigrayans activists are using it. Stop Tigray genocide is one of the like campaigns, hashtags or whatever. Can you make? I mean, I think you've already done it, so feel free to not completely repeat yourself if you don't want to. but make the case for us as to why, you know, this is very specifically as well like a crime of genocide, which, and kind of the follow-up question to that, or like part of that same question is, clearly I've read a lot of media coverage and whatnot, and that term is often not used. Like there seems to be a hesitation with using that term. So can you kind of talk to us about that?
Yeah, thanks. Yes, I think Tigrayans are rightly using the term because we know what took place. We know, like even though it's fragments of information, we know what took place in Tigray. We know what took place in the village and how things were carried out. And according to the UN Office for Genocide Prevention and whatever name they call themselves, genocide entails it means like it's an act of intent. It's an act of intent plus physical act of destroying or doing something harmful. So it could be killing members of a specific group, or whether it's ethnic group or a political group or religious group, or it's causing serious bodily harms to members of that group. It is about causing harm to the reproductive capabilities of this group. It is about forcefully transferring people, like children of the group, to another group in order to convert them, in order to assimilate them. And it has two components. So you have the mental intent, the intent part, and it has the physical element to it. So in terms of the mental or the intent side of it, we see it everywhere in the Ethiopian rhetoric, in the political discourse of Ethiopia. So starting from the prime minister calling Tigrayans. So there is one thing that people, like international observers, either misunderstand or don't want to really understand. That's the calling Tigrayans cancer is something that we need to be cautious about. Calling Tigrayans weeds is something that we need to think about, because when he calls Tigrayans weeds, it means that they have to be weeded out. They have to be erased from the landscape or from the body politic of the country. When they are cancer, they have to be surgically removed, which surgically removed is what the Ethiopian state and its allies have been doing throughout the last 19 months. So we have had the prime minister himself and his advisors calling Tigrayans all kind of derogatory names, which call for physical violence against Tigrayans. For example, the advisor to the prime minister, who is Christian Deacon, by the way, calling Tigrayan wombs, the mother of the wombs of Tigrayan mothers possessed by evil and poisonous demons. That's in quotation. And he also argues that Tigrayan, those wombs should never give birth to a next generation of Tigrayans. And that is clearly what we saw when the Ethiopian and the armies were in Tigray. They were trying to erase everything that's Tigrayan, including from my home, everything that we have, the stories that we have, the home that we built, everything around us was getting erased through the campaign. So when in terms of the physical, so that's the intent and the physical aspect of it, you could see from the systematic destruction of everything that people depend on in order to ensure that the group suffers physically, like in terms of hunger, in terms of access to medicine, in terms of access to schools, and access to all kinds of services. So we have like 90% of the school facilities, schools in remote rural villages being destroyed. And we have reports showing that. We have the medical facilities, I think, according to MSF, which was like long-time report, almost about more than 70% of the health facilities in the region were either looted or destroyed. You have every factory, like I said, destroyed, so making sure that people face starvation. And we have seen campaigns, like clear orchestrated campaigns, trying to prevent people from farming, from planting their land, in order to make them starve to death. We have, and also like from the way killings are carried out, like you could see the intent, you could see why the soldiers were doing the things they were doing for. So in Amharic or in the Ethiopian tradition, to throw something off a cliff is to kind of get rid of it, to erase it. and we have seen Ethiopian soldiers pulling young men from across villages and taking them to a cliff edge, shooting them, making sure that they fall off the cliff. That is clearly symbolic, clearly showing the intent of the killing. And we have seen soldiers burning Tigrayans alive. We have seen soldiers rounding like 50 to 100 soldiers standing and stoning Tigrayans to death. And that is not something that just happens because you are angry at something. It is intentional. It is to traumatize the population. It is to show that they are trying to erase us, to get rid of us. And 500,000, I think that's even a conservative estimate. There is a report by the University of Ghent that shows University of Ghent in Belgium that shows an estimate of 500,000 people, or half a million people, have been either killed, brutally killed, or starved to death throughout the war. And I believe that's even a conservative estimate because we don't have access to the data on the ground. And another aspect of it is the systematic campaign of rape and sexual violence against women and girls in Tigray. And that is even like at some point Samantha Power, the leader of the administrator of the USAID, who is genocide expert, by the way, was describing what happened in Tigray as a systematic way of destroying the reproductive capabilities of Tigrayan population, and that is what we saw from what the rapists, the soldiers that raped the Tigrayan women were saying. We could see that they were actually doing what the advisor to the prime minister was saying in public. That is, making sure that the Tigrayan womb doesn't give birth to next generation. They were telling them in words and in acts. They were putting hot iron rods in their wombs. They were putting all kind of foreign substances in their wombs to make sure that they don't reproduce and to make sure that they are brutalized. So the situation in Tigray clearly meets the definition of the term genocide according to the UN Convention.
It's very clear, especially, I mean, everything you just mentioned, especially the gendered aspect of it. As soon as you start seeing things like obsessing over wombs and describing wombs as essentially like demographic threats, like that's actually a term used by like across the board whenever these cases of genocides have happened, from the Bosnian example, which is pretty well studied, to obviously the Rwanda one. Even more recently with both Syria and Xinjiang and obviously even elements of it in Ukraine, we have been seeing these calls by dominant elites or by government representatives or what have you, treating, let's say in this case, Tigrayan women as essentially complicit just by the fact that they are women, complicit in resisting just by their very existence, essentially. And so, like, the kind of follow-up question I had to that, and as you can see, it's a kind of broad umbrella question. The role of diasporas, you're very active. Obviously, there's a very clear desire, a very clear sense of responsibility as well, and duty in many ways. As it happens, we're recording this on May 24th. I just saw 2 days ago in Australia, I think it was, Cardinal Berhane Jesus was confronted by Tigray protesters, for example, over his role in the genocide. People can look that up. I think I saw it on YouTube. So clearly diasporas, and I've myself, whenever I would see either the hashtag pop up on Twitter or if I see a story of a protest or whatnot, you definitely see the diaspora as being very active. Can you sort of talk a bit about the role of diasporas and how they've been in many ways helping, as being a good example of that, like helping even make this episode possible, helping even make these stories come out in a way that the Ethiopian regime and Eritrean regimes clearly, were not intended or did not want these stories to come out?
Yeah, so I think I have like enormous respect for the Tigrayan diaspora. Prior to the war, I wasn't that much connected to so much going on in Ethiopia or in Tigray. I mean, I follow it because it was my home. But following the war, we have become very connected. We have become almost like a family. And I have said it before that like when the atrocities, when more and more atrocities happen on all sides of Tigray, you feel the pain of a friend that you know who knows the victim. You feel like everyone feels like a family. So and that's because we have been a family. We have been really active in terms of telling the stories of our family families back home. And one of the things that the Ethiopian state or the call it the alliance did was to impose communication blackout. And the hope by doing that was to finish this war in the darkness, like without anyone knowing about it. But the Tigrayan diaspora knew this, and we kind of organized. We not necessarily organized in terms of groups, but organized as a community across the board to tell like every small story that we can find about what's going on to our family. Yes, I think we have to some degree achieved, like you said, like you could notice there are some things, some stories coming out from our efforts, uh, but it's also the reception of it has been really disappointing, like internationally. For example, like the we throughout our campaigns we have managed to show that the extent of the damage, the extent of the crisis, but the response in terms of, for example, defining the event, defining the crisis for what it is, which is genocide, has been delayed or suspended by many actors, including the U.S. State Department, which had previously declared that there was ethnic cleansing campaign going on, and they were working on a genocide dissemination report, but they postponed it because they see that as something that can hamper peace process, a non-existing peace process. So the diaspora has been going between actively trying to show what is going uh, on the one hand, on the other hand, sort of frustration from lack of response from the international community, lack of response from actors that could have had impact on or like an impact on the crisis. So yes, we have tried to do our best in terms of communicating the stories.
The element of this I wanted to ask is the role of the international community. I mean, you're in Norway, and of course the Peace Prize and that sort of thing, the Nobel Peace Prize. Um, this is at the end of the day a prime minister who did receive it in 2019 for his role. I don't know whatever in I don't know the details, but like in supposedly ending the conflict with Eritrea at the very least, which was like a very long, protracted conflict. Can you talk to us a bit about like the significance, like obviously the brutal irony in that, receiving it just a year before this campaign wins, and like the kind of attached question to that, or the complementary question to that, is the role of the international community. You just mentioned, you talked about it a bit now, but can you talk a bit about it more in the sense of, obviously we're not just dealing with ignorance or helplessness or whatever, we're also dealing with complicity, we're dealing with the desire to ignore things even though we know what's happening, and so on.
Yes, thanks for bringing that question. I have probably talked about the Nobel Peace Prize Committee before, so it's ironic, but it's also not ironic. I think the Nobel Peace Committee was ignorant, or they were willingly ignorant to not see Abiy Ahmed for who he is before they awarded him the Nobel Peace Prize. So uh, so for someone who at a scale of the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, someone who at a position of the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, they should have seen what happened following the opening the peace deal with Eritrea. They should have followed what was going on between the opening of the borders with between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and what happened following that, and up to the day they awarded him the Nobel Peace Prize, because a lot had happened, and the prime minister wasn't looking like someone who would win Nobel Peace Prize if they had carefully followed him. But following the start of the war, we have been trying to tell or to push the Peace Center in Oslo to at least issue a statement of concern, and it took them more than 500 days to issue a statement of concern, which was basically nothing to compare it with what this guy has called, and what the fact that he is a Nobel Peace Prize has done to Tigrayans. So, so what it has done is, like, we, at the beginning of the war, nobody can believe the stories that we were telling. Nobody can believe that a Nobel Peace Prize winning prime minister could do the atrocities, the horrific atrocities that his army and his army of his allies were doing in Tigray. So it took months and months, and it took the involvement of international actors like MSF and others to show the brutality of this regime. It took a lot of reports to show the extent of damage that this guy is doing in Tigray, because people were sort of blinded by the fact that this is a Nobel Peace Prize winning prime minister, and was just 1 year, less than a year before the war. So that is incredibly painful to see the irony of that. But broadly, on the international community, on the one hand, we see clear, like, silence. I mean, air silence, including from the Peace Prize, but include other actors, like lots of UN departments, UN offices. We see air silence from European powers, which normally would talk about human rights violation and all that. They have been to a large degree silent. On the other hand, we see clear complicity in support of, like, some actors are actually supporting the war, endorsing the war and supporting it. The African Union is the primary actor here. Like, the head of the African Union Commission, Moussa Faki, clearly on a statement endorsed the war on Tigray, saying that the Ethiopian state was taking the appropriate steps to contain whatever he said. So, being the African Union, being the regional body that is supposed to deal with this kind of crisis, and has jurisdiction over this kind of crisis, also prevented other actors from intervening, from pushing for dialogue, pushing for end to the war. So, for example, if you complain to European Union officials about their inaction, they say, "Oh, you have the African Union. The African Union is bringing this negotiator and that negotiator, who are basically doing nothing in terms of, like, addressing the problem." So, and then, of course, the paralysis of the UN, like, it's not paralysis, it's complicity on part of, for example, the Director General, the Secretary General of the United Nations. Every time there is a report that kind of shows the brutality of the war, the brutality of the Ethiopian state, he comes up with a dressing statement saying, the Prime Minister has guaranteed me that this is not going to happen. That the Prime Minister has told me that Eritrean troops are not involved, for example. That's what he said at some point. But we knew that Eritreans were there. We knew they were doing all kind of brutal stuff. But then you have complicity on behalf on the part of the Secretary General when it comes to that. And the UN office in Addis Ababa is, I mean, like, I could easily say that they are the mouthpiece of the regime. They are, like, sort of propagating the same talking points of the regime, instead of condemning, instead of, like, telling the truth that there is genocide taking place in the region, in the region, and that those kind of have contributed to silence, global silence, because if the UN doesn't report, if the UN doesn't show the actual numbers and data on the ground, I mean, who are we to who is a British person or a Norwegian person to say anything about the crisis? So that has been very, very difficult. For example, the UN's the last report, comprehensive sort of assessment report on the famine situation in Tigray was on the 4th of June last year, so almost a year now, and there hasn't been any reporting of what is going on in Tigray in terms of famine for the last 1 year, which is clearly problematic given that the situation has really deteriorated, and the UN has a mandate to do that, a mandate to report, a responsibility to report on this kind of situation. And the EU was one of the first responders to the crisis. Like the EU officials were actually going back and forth to Addis and Sudan to sort of like calm down the situation, to pressure the Ethiopian state. At some point, the EU, I mean, they still have, the EU cut budgetary support to the Ethiopian government as a way of pressuring it. But now we see the EU is also sort of resuming collaboration with the Ethiopian state. So in retrospect, in the hindsight, we could see why the EU was in panic in the beginning. One of them was the concern for migration crisis induced by the war, like forced by the war. So they were scared that like Tigrayan migrants would flow out of the country and end up in the southern shore of the European Union. But then the Prime Minister understood this. The Prime Minister understood the European Union's concern about migration and managed to blockade all the borders of the region in order to ensure that there were no migrants leaving. And that did it for the European Union. They didn't have to pressure the Ethiopian state anymore because they had already made sure that there were no migrants. That's one of the explanations we can give. But also, the EU sees geopolitical competition. They see that Russia and China are gaining hegemony over Eastern Africa, over the Red Sea, and they don't want to lose that, and they don't want to press the Ethiopian state more than they could, or more than they would like. So that's something that's preventing them from doing anything meaningful. And the designation of the crisis as a genocide, the lack of it emanates from those kind of dynamics in terms of geopolitics. And yeah.
While you were talking, I could only imagine some friends of mine who are Bosnians or Syrians or acquaintances who are from Xinjiang may probably nodding their head along and finding this very familiar. The EU's role in prioritizing stopping migrants at all costs, the desire to quote-unquote preserve the state, the Ethiopian state, over any other kind of humanitarian concern is very much the story of Syria. It's just Xinjiang, obviously, you mentioned before, the obsession with wombs. It's something that we saw repeated time and time again in the discourse of the CCP there. It's just the parallels strike me as quite something. And the other thing is that I actually just noticed, while you were talking, I noticed the dates because I hadn't made the link at the time, that 2019 saw 2 Nobel Prizes given to either a man who later commits genocides, in the case of Abiy Ahmed, or in the case of Peter Handke, a man who has denied genocide, the literature one, in the case of the Bosnian one, pretty notoriously. So that says a lot, because even then, I remember with the Handke case, and there's a very good article on Mangal Media for those who want, written by friend Adnan, on that, Wings of Denial it's called, or something like that. Because the role of having that title is that now I go to a bookshop and you always have the title of, Nobel Prize winner. It's something that it boosts your sales. It ends up being, at the front of the bookshops or what have you. People, it's almost like a unconscious thing that happens. Like you hear Nobel Prize winner, you won't then associate that with crimes against humanity or genocides or whatever. You assume that those things are separate. And this works. We see this happen time and time again. So in this case, we have to be talking about complicity, and especially, in the case of Abiy Ahmed, the Nobel Prize the Nobel Committee, whatever, did not know what he would do a year later. But given that he did that, there should have been and there should still be some reconsideration about what that title means, and and so on, even withdrawing it, obviously. The other thing, let Let me see if I forgot. Yes, no, the other thing is, I am very curious in these situations of the role of cultural elites, by which I just mean celebrities, sports people, what have you. In some situations, we see them rallying against oppression in some other context, but often what we actually end up seeing is, in the case of Syria, for example, a lot of the pre-2011 celebrities ended up just standing with the regime. Those who opposed the regime essentially ended up in exile, of course. What has been the role of Ethiopian elites, essentially, like, celebrities and whatnot, in supporting the government, opposing, what has been the main role?
Yes, I think you mentioned earlier about the Tigrayan girl confronting Cardinal Brahana Yusuf. I don't know if he was in Australia, but
I
that
think
was
Australia, yeah.
yeah. So that was like clearly what she said in that video is clearly what he did. Like he, I'm like, well, he's a cultural leader, like a religious leader, and him and many leaders of the different religious institutions in Ethiopia clearly stood by the regime. So when you who are you to oppose the regime when the head of the Catholic Church or the Muslim mufti are supporting the regime? Who are you to? So we had at the beginning of the war the distinction was clear. Like there was complicity by all, support by all, by well, nearly all religious institutions, religious cultural institutions for the war. They were supporting it, and we have also seen like elites, including, for example, Ethiopia's marathon legend Haile Selassie, the Olympic legend Haile Gebrselassie, standing and even going to war fronts in support of the Ethiopian army. We have seen musicians, all kind of musicians, going to the, even including to the front, supporting the army, and that is not a strange phenomenon, given like if you see it against historical events like this in other countries. I mean, like we didn't. There were not so many Germans in Nazi Germany opposing the persecution of the Jews and others. There were not many Hutus in Rwanda opposing the Tutsis, the murder of the Tutsis, and that's similar in other contexts. And it is a result of broad, large-scale propaganda campaign that was going on for many years, even prior to the coming of Abiy Ahmed to premiership, and it continued throughout the war. The campaign has intensified. So even if you are a celebrity and would like to oppose the war, you would be in trouble. If you are in Ethiopia, you would face persecution. You would face arrest and all kind of problems. And we have seen that. For example, there was a pro-war rally in Addis, in the main square of Addis, in the autumn, and musicians were invited, like several singers were invited to sing in support of the war. And one of them on the stage, he said, like, I don't want to sing for war. I want to sing for peace. I want to sing for reconciliation and for dialogue. And then he was taken out of the stage, and the next day or a few days later he disappeared, and a few days later he came out all in different medias and said, I'm sorry for what I said on the stage. I shouldn't have said that. I should have supported my country regardless of what. So you could see that you would not be able to stand by yourself, to act by yourself in this kind of situation. So yeah, so the silence and the complicity by elites in the country has been really really scary, and the result of that is like complete. I mean, Tigrayans. I don't think Tigrayans will ever, not in the short term, will ever consider themselves as Ethiopians, given how we've been treated in the last 1.5 years. So, yeah. For example,
Uh,
I don't. I don't blink. I don't feel anything when I see a celebrity, an Ethiopian celebrity. I only get angry. I only see their complicity to when my family, when my relatives, my friends have been brutalized by the state.
No, of course. Thanks for that. Sorry, there's one thing I should have asked it before, but I think we just we mentioned the role of Eritrea as being, you know, the partner essentially of the Ethiopian regime here. But why? I think it probably confused a lot of people who don't understand. I mean, until recently I didn't understand it, to be honest. I kind of know the answer because I did the research for this episode only. But it's very it is puzzling, at least at first sight, as to why they would be so invested essentially in taking part in something that seems to be Abiy Ahmed and, you know, his circle's priorities rather than Eritrea's one.
Yeah, I think that's yes, it's puzzling, but I think the idea that it's Abiy Ahmed's project, entirely Abiy Ahmed's project, isn't right. In fact, when you see when you connect the dots, you see Isaias, Eritrean guys, role behind the project. And I don't know if you know, but Eritrea was part of Ethiopia until 1991, until 1993 actually. They had brutal war of independence that lasted for 30 years between 1961 and 1991. And when the military regime in Ethiopia collapsed in 1991, they were allowed to hold referendum whether to decide whether they want to stay within Ethiopia or to be an independent country. They became independent. They chose to be independent in 1993. And then we had this guy that was in power from at least from the time when Eritrea became like sort of like a de facto independent country in 1991 up to now. He is the only president of the country. And in 1998, even though the Ethiopia and Eritrea kind of stayed friendly from like for the 6 years, in 1998, Eritrea invaded parts of Tigray, like the northern part of Tigray, and the other regions like the Afar region to the east. So the borders, it pushed into the territory of Ethiopia. The war was very bloody, so it lasted for 2 years and ended in 2000. And we know that tens of thousands of people were killed from both sides from both countries. The border conflict kind of like it didn't end; it just froze where it is. So we had standoff border on both sides of the border for almost 20 years until 2018 when Abiy Ahmed became a prime minister, and Abiy kind of like pushed for a peace deal with Eritrea. And this peace deal was very obscure. We don't like almost no one knows how this negotiation took place. We don't know, like none of, like, for example, Ethiopian institutions, the parliament included, were supposed to be involved in this since this is a national matter, but they were not involved. It was brokered by the United Arab Emirates instead of the African Union or other multilateral organizations. So we have this weird peace deal that was signed in 2018, which led to the opening of the borders in September 2018. And the opening of the borders and all that was really euphoric. Everyone was happy because families that were cut off for 20 years managed to meet for the first time. So including myself, we were happy about that. But of course, with a reservation, because we don't know what kind of deal these guys made behind the curtain, because there was no clear public process for it. So, and then like you said earlier, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for that, for ending the war. In hindsight, and as a careful observer at the time, the peace deal was really problematic, and it didn't sit well in me, and lacked any form of institutionalism, like the parliament and all. So, but now we know from the following the war, we know that it was a war pact. It wasn't a peace deal, and the war pact was a war against the Tigrayan political leadership, and by implication, by extension, Tigray. as Isaias, the Eritrean guy, considered Tigray as his enemy for many years, as his final block to destroy in order to kind of like extend his hegemony over East Africa, which he considers is should be under his rule. And following the opening of the border wasn't it didn't stay for long. It was only a couple of months, and something has happened, and without any notification, the borders were closed again. So, and we saw from that time on, we saw the Ethiopian and Eritrean regimes, rulers going back and forth between Asmara and Addis, and visiting military installations and military training camps, and so you could see that they were preparing for something, for a war. And yeah, so when the war broke out, we knew from weeks before the war that the Eritrean troops were mobilizing and going closer to the Tigrayan borders, and there are reports indicating that. So this is how we ended up involving Eritrea, and so it was that sort of vengeance for the loss in 1998 2000 war, which Eritrea to a large degree lost because they were pushed off the border.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, it's just such an incredible turn of events. It's almost like if you weren't paying, like, obviously if you're not Tigrayan or whatnot, and you weren't paying for some time, you could be completely, you get lost in the details, which is obviously something that I've seen, non-Syrians. That's how they usually think of Syria, as like so many changing actors and so many changing dynamics and whatnot. But underlying a lot of what we've been talking about is the desire for power and desire for essentially domination. Usually I finish the episodes by asking someone to kind of recommend 3 books. But before doing that, is there anything that you wanted me to ask that we didn't get into as much, or you wanted to expand upon? I mean, obviously, the topic is, given what it is, an hour 20, whatever this is going to be long, is cannot do it justice. But yeah, so is there anything else that you wanted to at least add that we didn't?
I think one of the things that I would like to sort of underline is that this is a genocidal war. There is a genocide, so there is evidence of it everywhere. I think it requires recognition of it like that by international actors, like by governments, by multilateral organizations like the UN. And the reason why we need that kind of recognition is because that recognition will lead to intervention that meets the recognition as a genocide. And I think everyone should sort of like, given the amount of evidence we have, everyone should sort of, every listener in this episode, for example, should push and ask for recognizing this crisis as a genocide, and help us with that, I think.
No, I will try my best to include all of the reports that I read in preparing this as well in the description, but otherwise it's not that difficult to find them. So if people want to look them up, they can do so. Are there resources that you yourself would recommend off the top of your head for people who are listening?
So for example, like they could follow my tweeting, for example, at Teklehaymanot G. They could also follow websites like, for example, tghat.com, Tghat.com. They are really doing a good job by chronicling, sort of like documenting everyday things in Tigray. And we have omna.org, which is OMNA. They're also doing really well in terms of like advocacy and all that. And there are like reports by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch which show the extent of what they don't necessarily show the extent of the crisis, but they show to a large degree they show the gravity of the crisis in Tigray. So read reports by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, and follow the Tigrayan websites to find more information about the crisis.
Amazing.
And they can, of course, audience can also contact me whenever they want to find something.
Amazing. I will include, of course, your Twitter handle as well in the show notes. All right. Well, there's never a perfect segue to this, but that's how I usually end the episodes. What are 3 books that you would recommend to our listeners, and why those 3?
Yes, I was thinking about that. So I have been, so I'm like kind of shifting my field of study because of the war, and my readings on the last 1.5 year has been to the darker side of politics. So sort of like trying to explain what's going on in Tigray and why things are the way they are. For example, why people, non-Tigrayans, like elites, like you said earlier, are complicit or silent in the face of this kind of crisis. So a perfect read for that is very long but very like a must kind of read is Hannah Arendt's The Origin of Totalitarianism book, which is sort of like explains how totalitarianism works and totalitarianism in this kind of situation. So how hate against certain group leads to the kind of situation we are in Tigray, and the role of imperialism, globalization, and the need to eradicate certain elements, the anti-global, um, multinational, anti like unifying actors should be removed. Kind of that kind of thinking is very interesting to read. So that is a very important book to read for people around my field. The second read is, since I am still on the genocide side of the story, I think it's important to read Roméo Dallaire's book, Shake the Hands of the Devil with the Devil. That's a account of a Canadian peacekeeper in Rwanda during the genocide, and he does really well in terms of like capturing what happens and what happens in that kind of situation and why the international community turns its back on a crisis like that. And on the dark side of comic books, I would recommend George Orwell's Animal Farm, which is very relevant. So I have those 3 books that I would recommend anyone to read. They are not very easy reads, but they are relevant and they will stay relevant, I think.
I haven't read the second one. I've read the Arendt and the Orwell one. Definitely recommend those for sure. The second one, I'll definitely check it out as well. Well, honestly, thank you a lot for your time. I'm sure this was not easy, but I appreciate the time and the effort that you put into this.
No, thank you for having me. It was really good to talk to you and to share my thoughts on the crisis.
The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.